talks. Today we're super excited because we're joined by Sarah Heisenroth from Beardsley Community Farm, and she's going to be talking to us about sustainable gardening practices. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Like Brianna said, my name is Sarah. I'm the education coordinator here at Beardsley Community Farm. And we are going to go over sustainable gardening practices. Before I get into talking about sustainable gardening practices, I'm going to give a quick intro of Beardsley in case you're unfamiliar. Our mission, what we do is we work to increase food security in Knoxville by providing fresh produce donations, accessible education, and land and resources for gardening. Our team is composed of 6 individuals, staff members. There's 2 doctors and myself, and then we have 3 AmeriCorps members. And we are in Irrigation Farm. We're located in Mechanicsville in Malcolm Martin Park. We're growing on about 4 acres. Within the park, there's a bunch of garden plots. And we have an apiary and we have chickens. And then outside of the farm, we also help to maintain community plots throughout Knox County. So we are doing work on the farm and outside of the farm throughout the community. And what we're doing is we're trying to show folks how to be sustainable through the practices we use. Also, we are not certified organic, but we use organic practices in growing vegetables. And we grow an average of 10,000 pounds a year of produce that we donate. Like I said, we have a fruit and nut orchard, and we don't spray or anything like that. We harvest all the fruit. And we have 3 beehives, which are great. Their honeybees are great pollinators. And we maintain our hives. Sorry, watch. Anyways, there's a cat in the background. We maintain our hives and they help to pollinate our veggies and fruits. And we also are able to harvest their honey once a year. And all the honey that we harvest, we're able to sell to have proceeds go back to the farm. We have 8 chickens on the farm. They're all layers, and all the eggs they produce, we donate as well. And we actually use their bedding in their coop to add to our compost. So their poop is full of great nutrients. And so they give back to the farm by adding their nutrients to our compost. We have 2 farm cats that help with rodent control. We have compost. We're recycling all of our waste scraps from our kitchen, and we also take community compost. So we're recycling waste materials that way. We do have water collection and irrigation systems, and we use electric mowers and weed whackers to reduce gas use and try. Our hope is to get solar panels on top of our barn so that we can get the power for our mowers and weed whackers totally through sustainable ways. And so the presentation is going to be on sustainable gardening practices. And there's so much we could talk about in ways to be sustainable when you're gardening. So I'm just going to focus in on 3 things: soil, water, and care. And that's going to be what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to start with soil. So soil is, I think, something that people tend to forget getting in gardening. It's like one of the most important things when you are gardening, because having healthy soil encourages healthy plant growth. Before you even start gardening, you want to think about your soil. So like, what is soil? Soil is 4 different things. It's air, organic matter, and broken rock pieces. And believe it or not, so the air and water, it's about 50% pore space to make that happen. And let me show you a quick breakdown, get an idea of what I mean when we're looking at soil. So it's about broken rocks. So it could be like pieces of sand and clay. In this region of Knoxville, we get a lot of heavy clay. It's only 2% of organic matter, so we think of like our compost, but with vegetable gardening, that organic matter is really, really important to consider. And then the pore space is about 50%, so air and water can get through. And so back to the broken rock. So if it's sand, if your soil is really sandy, it can hold air really well, but not so much water. If it's really heavy with clay, it can hold water really well and not so much air. So ideally with your soil, it would be a good mix between sand and clay, so that it can have a really, can hold air, both air and water really well. And it's the term used for that is called loamy soil, which is between the two. And if you have really heavy clay soil or really heavy sand soil, adding organic matter throughout the years will help to create this loaminess that we're looking for when we're growing vegetables. Preparing your soil. There's 3 things you want to keep in mind when preparing. First of all, you don't want to rush. When you're getting ready to start preparing your soil, you want to wait till it's ready to be worked. If it's really wet or really frozen, if your ground's really wet or frozen and you start trying to work it, impacting your soil even more. So you want to wait till it's a good moisture point. And let me see if my Wi-Fi is. You still hearing me okay? Cool.
Yes.
Great. So you don't want to rush. You also want to remove overwintered materials. So if you decided to grow cover crops in your winter bed, and I can talk more about cover crops in a little bit, either you want to cut those down or you want to remove and turn them under before they go to seed. If you put a bunch of mulch on your soil, you're going to want to rake away your mulch if it hadn't decomposed. And then the third thing you want to do is you want to add compost. You're going to add about like 2 to 4 inches of compost on top of your soil and then work it in. So why do we add compost in? First of all, it increases organic matter, which is really vital to having when we think about the nutrients, right? So having good, healthy nutrients in our soil will give nutrients into our vegetables that we're growing. And it helps, having compost in soil helps to better absorb moisture and then hold moisture for longer. So then you don't have to water your garden as much if you're adding compost. It attracts beneficial organisms like worms and little buggies that are gonna break down some materials and add a beneficial matter, organic matter to the soil. And then also adding compost kind of makes your soil act more like a sponge so that it'll hold on to the nutrients that are in the soil. If you're gonna like add, if you're gonna add like a fertilizer or anything like that, if you have compost worked into your soil, it'll hold on to those nutrients kind of like a sponge rather than having them run off when you water your soil, if that makes any sense. Okay, so I know that y'all had a talk on compost. I'm not gonna talk too much about it, but and there's a lot of really great information on the internet to look more into compost, but basically making your own compost, do it. It'll save you money in being able to amend your bed and add compost every year. And it's a great way to recycle nutrients back into your garden, waste kitchen scraps that you would throw in the landfill. You're basically reducing your waste, reducing landfill waste by recycling your nutrients back into your own garden. And typically with most compost that you're going to create, it's going to be a 1 to 3 ratio, 1 part like kitchen scraps and then 3 parts brown. So that could be leaves or straw or wood chips, paper. I throw in like paper towels and stuff. Yeah, and like I said, the internet is a great resource for figuring out what kind of compost pile would be good for you. At Beardsley, we use a 3-bin system because we are producing quite a bit of compost. For maybe your home garden, there's different like Turner systems you can buy, or different, you could build compost pile with pallets. There's so many different options. So I would say research what will work well for your space. And how do we add our finished compost to our garden? So depending on how hot your compost gets, it's going to take a little while for it to break down, but once it's fully broken down and looks really lovely and looks almost like soil, that's when you're going to be able to add it to your garden. We don't want to add any unbroken down food scraps to our garden. So you're going to add about 2 to 4 inches every year before you plant. And then once you layer that on top, you're going to rake or wiggle it into your soil, so it's pretty well combined. And for perennials, if y'all don't know what a perennial is, that's a plant that will survive 3 years or longer. So we can think of like trees and bushes, or for vegetables, asparagus, or maybe your herb beds. You'll want to top dress. So that means just add a layer of compost about 2 inches each year to that perennial bed. Those are things you won't be taking up. You'll just add more nutrients each year because they'll need it. Yeah, anything else I'm missing? Yeah, that's it. All right, so now I'm gonna, along with soil, you need to fertilize it, especially for vegetable gardens. Like I had mentioned just that your vegetables are full of nutrients, right? And they're getting all of those nutrients from the soil. And when you water your soil and when your vegetables are taking up nutrients, your soil is going to lose those nutrients. So you've got to keep adding throughout the summer, especially if you're like growing tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. Those are big feeders of soil's nutrients. So you gotta keep adding nutrients to your soil. So usually you're gonna wanna add a fertilizer around the same time that you're starting to plant. I would say about every 2 to 3 weeks is when you're gonna fertilize your garden. So it says I wrote here to add it like when you see leaf development, and then flower development and fruit development. So that's about every 2 to 3 weeks, you're gonna start adding fertilizer to your bed. And I'm also just very briefly gonna go over fertilizers. But if you're gonna buy a fertilizer, you're gonna see 3 numbers. There's 16 main nutrients that your soil needs and that are added to fertilizers, but the top 3 are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And typically, so the 3 numbers, what we're seeing here on the screen is 15, 5, and 10. So it's always going to be NPK. So looking at this ratio, what I'm seeing is 15% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. So that just gives you an idea of like how much of each of those nutrients are going to be in the fertilizer you're buying. And if you're just starting out with a new garden, I kind of suggest buying like a balanced fertilizer. So like a 10, 10, 10. So you get equal amounts of all of the different nutrients to get a well-rounded nutrients into your soil. Yeah, so after a few years, if you're really going at your garden, and you can eventually get your soil tested, and it'll tell you what you're lacking in nutrients, and then you can buy a fertilizer that will give you more of nitrogen if you're lacking nitrogen, or more of potassium. But yeah, there's a lot to research here, but that's just the general understanding of like what you're looking at when you're buying fertilizer and what those numbers mean. So I had talked about when to apply about every 2 to 3 weeks. And so if you're just starting out with you're just starting a garden for the first time, for the first 2 years, you're gonna wanna add fertilizer about a month before you start planting. So it gives your bed and soil some time to absorb those nutrients. but after about 2 years, you can just add it at planting time. And then, like I had said, you're gonna add about every 3 weeks. And what I like to recommend, especially since we're using sustainable gardening practices, is to always look for organic or OMRI listed products. That OMRI label means that it's organic and certified organic. And so that's what we use here at Beardsley, and what I use at home. I always make sure it says it's organic or OMRI listed. And I try to avoid chemical fertilizers. They do require a lot of fossil fuels to produce, and they are pretty harsh on your plants. But if you are really wanting to use it, I would say to follow the directions on the package, because they are really pungent in the chemical that they're using, and you want to make sure you're not doing too much. Okay. All right. So we're still on soil. I'm going to quickly talk about this idea of no-till principles. For those of you who don't know what the word till means, it means to like plow or cultivate the land. Typically, we think of like big scale farms that use tractors to get a field ready. So they loosen up the soil. That's called tilling. And a sustainable practice is no tilling. And there's 3 principles that I like to think about with no-till. It's to always keep your soil covered, it's to disturb the soil as little as possible, and to also keep your soil planted as much as possible. So you might be like, why are we avoiding tilling? I thought that was the normal thing to do. So the reason is it destroys biological ecosystems and organic matter. It does ultimately lead to poor nutrient and water, will increase wind and water erosion. And oh yes, it releases carbon from the soil, because carbon in the air is adding to climate change. And we want to keep that carbon in the ground because it's really beneficial when it's in the ground. And then we also it churns up seeds. And so the next thing you might be asking is like, I'm just growing a small garden in my house. I'm not going to be tilling. What does this have to do with me? So the reason I'm bringing this whole thing up is because I think there's a lot of good takeaways with no-till practices that we can add to our home gardens. So basically, how can we like take this idea of no-till and add it to our small garden? So what we can do is always keep our beds covered. If we're not covering landscape fabrics, we want to also add a deep compost mulch. We can cropping, and I'll describe a little bit how Beardsley is doing something like that in a minute. And cover crops. So cover crops, if you're not familiar, are typically things that folks will put in the ground in October. They're not going to use a garden bed through the winter time. It's usually like a mixture of rye, clover, and peas. And what those things do is they add nutrients to the soil. So you're going to be adding nutrients and aerating your soil when you're not using it, which is really great. So lots of people add cover crops when they're like, I'm not going to use my bed through this winter time. I'll just throw some cover crops down, and you're doing no work, and your soil is getting a lot happier that way. And then also we can remember to always mulch. So for perennials, I suggest using wood chips. For annuals, I would suggest you using cardboard, leaves, or straw or grass clippings. So if there's empty spaces in your bed, mulching will keep the moisture in, and your soil is just going to be so much happier if it's covered. So always, the biggest takeaway is just to keep your beds covered or planted at all times. And so I can give a quick example of how, I can give a quick example of how Beardsley is doing, applying this no-till principle in a section of our farm. We are back in where we planted a bunch of garlic in a section of the farm. Garlic is an allium, and you typically plant it in the fall to harvest it the following spring. So we planted it in October, and we anticipate harvesting it around the end of May, early June. But after we planted our garlic, we put a hefty layer of straw on top to keep that covered. And then in February, we raked off that straw. We added a really heavy layer of compost between the garlic that was coming up. And we sprinkled a bunch of root seeds like carrots and radishes. And they are coming up now, and we're going to probably harvest them within the next couple weeks. And as we're harvesting, so we're intercropping. So we're working with the same bed and adding more crops to it so that there's more things going on, utilizing that space that would just be empty and not covered with anything. But as we are harvesting our radishes and carrots, we're actually going to transplant tomatoes into that garden. So it's constantly being cropped and worked. And we like adding the carrots and radishes, we're adding a lot of nutrients to the soil, and those tomatoes are going to take those nutrients up. So that's kind of an example of how we are applying these similar principles to our gardens. Okay. And then the last thing with soil is crop rotations. So we can think of plants as different families. If you're not so familiar with plant families, I would say research that. That's a great thing to know. So things like tomatoes, eggplants and peppers are nightshades. Things like kale, cabbage, and broccoli are brassicas. So those are all different families. And you want to change the location of your plant family season to season. So if I planted my tomatoes here and I had, if I had a very small bed and I planted tomatoes and then I had kale in the next bed, I would swap those the next year. In rotating your crops, you're going to help prevent disease. Some plants are more prone to diseases, especially from the soil, from old crops, if they're placed in the same spot each year or after the same year. It also helps prevent pest problems. Lots of times pests will try to go to the same, that will target like a brassica, will go to the same location that it was in last year to go after that brassica again, but you're going to trick them by switching it up. And also rotating your crops helps to add more nutrients. So you're reducing your loss of nutrients by switching things up. And mixing up the plants that add a lot of nutrients versus the plants that take away a lot of nutrients, if that makes sense. And the best way, I think, to remember to do crop rotations is to make a planting plan. So just keep a journal with where you're planting your things. And so if you're gonna next year set up your garden, you're gonna know where you wanna move things around. So that's the end of soil. The next thing we're going to talk about is water. So with watering system, you're going to want to water deep and infrequently. For established plants, that's about 2 to 3 times a week, ideally, even in the summertime. You're just going to hold it for longer so that you don't have to water as much. Your plants don't want to get watered too much. If they get overwatered, their roots might become more shallow. You want your roots to become deeper, and that actually helps it retain more moisture because there'll be more moisture as the roots go lower. So there's ways you can water your garden. You can do hand watering, which is pretty inexpensive. The only downside is it's pretty time consuming if you have to water, especially if you have a slightly big garden space. And you also have to be aware of not getting some foliage wet. A lot of times especially like with tomatoes, you want to avoid getting your foliage wet because wet foliage increases the probability of spreading diseases. So you always want to make sure you're just watering really close to the base of those plants. And then another option is drip irrigation. If you're unfamiliar with drip irrigation, I would say look this up. if you have a pretty big space that you're gardening, it's a little expensive to get started and can be difficult to set up, but in the long run, it's going to save you time because you just hook up your hose to the irrigation and you just like let it do its thing for like a couple hours, depending on your space. And you only have to do that 2 or 3 times a week. And then if you take good care of your irrigation products, you can use it year after year. And in the long run, you're not going to spend as much money because you already have the supplies from the previous years. And then another thing with watering or water is this idea of rainwater collection. Why is it good to collect rainwater? It helps to protect our rivers and streams from runoff pollution. Using rainwater, our plants prefer rainwater rather than city treated water. It'll help supplement your water supply. So you're not going to like pay for water coming from the city to water your plants. Instead, you'll use free water that just came from the sky. And yeah, it's pretty easy to harvest and use. I wrote down a couple of resources that you all might want to look into. The Water Quality Forum has a rain barrel program. I'm not sure where they're at with it. I just checked in and it seems like they're full, but you can, I think they allow you to submit an application or like a request to know when the program will be up and running. I think that's a really affordable option for catching rainwater. There's also this company called Knoxville Rainwater Management that helps to create rain barrels or rainwater collection for your house. Or you can use the internet and make your own and figure it out. That could be fun if you have the time for that. But yeah, once you get it set up, it's a really great thing to use, and your plants will really appreciate you using rainwater versus city water. Okay, and then the third thing that we had said we were going to talk about is care. One second. Yeah, so sustainable ways to care for your garden. I already went into this a little bit, but mulching is super important and a great way to be sustainable because it helps to keep moisture in and it helps to keep weeds out. Once again, with annual, most of the veggies you're going to grow, we like to use straw most of the time, or if you have leaves, whatever you have around is what I would suggest using. For perennials, like I have a picture of our blackberries, we use wood chips. So we put wood chips around like our blackberries and our raspberries and strawberries because there's something, I don't know all the science behind it, but wood chips are a little too much for most annual plants. I just know wood chips aren't very great for annuals, and it's like a little harsh for them, but it's okay for perennials. Okay, and then weeding. So we are anti-Roundup here at Beardsley, and so to be sustainable and to not add chemicals such as Roundup to our garden, so that we're eating really great food that doesn't have anything treated or doesn't have anything in the soil that we don't want to put in our bodies. We do a lot of hand weeding and use a lot of tools. So with weeding sustainably, what you need is really great tools. And I encourage you to invest in tools that you really love. What I really like to use if I'm doing like a smaller space with like some really deep weeds is this hand mattock. You can kind of see it on the far right. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the hand mattock is really great for getting tough weeds out in a small space or just hand weeding. And I also really love a scuffle hoe. That's the hoe that's right next to the mattock. That's an example. That's really great. If you're gonna create like straight rows and create enough space for your hoe to go through, that's like the easiest tool to use. And it'll save you time by not kneeling down and using your hands to weed everything if you do have a bigger space. And with weeding, I always suggest making a weed pile or adding it to your yard waste pickup. I don't like to add my weeds to my compost pile. I don't think my compost gets hot enough to break down those weed seeds. And my worry in adding weeds to your compost is that it will add more weed seeds to your beds when you add that compost to your soil. So I don't recommend adding your weeds back into your compost, especially Bermuda grass. That's the worst thing. And something I like to say when you're weeding and you only have a little time is to weed in order of importance. So if you only have 10 minutes to do some weeding when you get home, I would say go for the things that are going to seed or are flowering first. So I have a picture of this dandelion that's, it's ready to go and put its seeds everywhere. So we want to get those dandelions out real quick first. And then if you have more time, work on getting those invasive weeds like crabgrass and Bermuda and morning glory, things that are really persistent and will always be there. We want to get those out and then focus on the less invasive weeds like chickweed or henbit. They're always going to be there, but they're not as much of a stressor for me in the garden as things like dandelions that are flying all over and Bermuda grass. Okay, and so with care, there's this idea, there's this concept called integrative pest management. It's an effective and environmentally friendly way to manage pests without spraying. So there's, it's a pretty, it uses measures that start with prevention and then ways to keep them out and the safest ways to get rid of them once you realize you do have pests. So it's first preventing. The idea of integrative pest management is first working on prevention and making sure you have your garden set up so that it's not going to attract pests. And then you're going to think of ways to keep them out if you do think you might have them. And then if you definitely know you have them and you're having trouble getting rid of them, there's ways around that. So first with prevention, we want to grow healthy plants. So that looks like, remember, adding fertilizer and good compost to our gardens. If our plants are really growing well and have really great nutrients, they're going to be really healthy and less prone to attract diseases or pests. We want to choose disease resistant varieties of vegetables. There are a lot of really lovely heirlooms, but there's also options for seeds that are disease resistant and will attract less diseases and pests. And I had mentioned earlier about rotating crops so that you're going to trick those pests. They're going to be like, oh, I know where that kale was last year, and they're going to go and it's going to be eggplants all of a sudden, and they're like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. So we're going to rotate our crops to trick our pests. And I want to say we should set a tolerance level of what we're okay with. I included a picture of a piece of kale that has a few holes. Your brassicas might get eaten a little bit, but you can set, when you're growing organically, things like this happen, and you can be like, this kale has a little bit of holes, but it's still perfectly good to eat. So set a level that's good for yourself to be like, I'm okay with a few holes in my kale. It's still good, it's organic, it's full of good nutrients and has no bad chemicals on it. Just a few little bites from a bug. And then you also want to just check your plants regularly for insect damage. I like to look under leaves, that's where they're always hanging out, and see what's going on down there. And when you are checking, remember that not all bugs are bad bugs. There's a lot of really beneficial insects. And I would say, I'm not going to cover all of that today, but if you take the time to research what are beneficial versus non-beneficial insects, you'll get a good rough idea of what you want to keep on there and what's exciting to have, because it's like, oh, a ladybug, they're going to eat all those aphids. Let's keep the ladybugs. But if you see aphids, you're going to be like, oh no. Anyways, so just remember to not assume a bug is bad unless you know it's bad. So there's physical ways to deal with pests once you identify them. One way is to hand pick. So this is a picture, 1 second, sorry. Okay, so the picture of a Harlequin cabbage bug. I see them all the time in my garden and a few times at Beardsley. They're like in the stink bug family. They kind of look like ladybugs, but like not. But they love to eat brassicas. They get all up in the kale and broccoli, and they mate, and they eat a lot of the kale and kind of destroy the crop. So I think the best way to deal with these guys is just to hand pick them off and remove them, because they're pretty big, and once you can find them pretty easily. And you should look up what their eggs look like. They're these like round little black and white eggs that they'll put on the undersides of the brassicas, and you can easily just like take your finger and take it off. So that's one way to control that. And there's other bugs that you can just take off with your fingers too. You could also consider a strong stream of water. For things like brassicas and lettuces, it's okay to like get that foliage wet. Not so much tomatoes or eggplants and peppers. I would try to avoid that, but sometimes it's okay with a strong stream of water. You can prune off clusters of like aphids or small bugs with your hand clippers if you just see a cluster on 1 or 2 leaves. You can hang netting, and that could work for like things like birds that might get at your berries. Just put a loose bit of netting to prevent them from being able to get to it. We use a floating row. You can use a floating row cover. It's kind of the same thing you would use to cover your plants in the winter time to keep them warm. You can use it in the summer to prevent things like squash bugs from getting to your squash. Having that barrier over your plants will prevent bugs from getting to it. Shiny objects help for like things like berries, and if you put like old CDs or shiny tape around like a blueberry bush, it'll prevent birds from eating it because they get like confused when they see shiny things in the reflection of the sun. And then things like chicken wire too. I think of maybe like wire around trees that like woodpeckers like getting at a tree. Anyways, chicken wire can be used for like also for like groundhogs or rabbits from getting to your garden. So those are physical control methods for pests. Then we can think of biological. So there are some things that are well, okay, so first of all, we can introduce beneficial insects. Believe it or not, you can like buy ladybugs and put them in your garden. More ladybugs that way. Or if you see a praying mantis, like little sack somewhere, like you can like move it around and put it somewhere where you know it'll be beneficial and eat bugs that you don't want there. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with companion planting. It's the idea of like planting 2 things that will complement each other. So my first thought in this picture, we were growing tomatoes last year with marigolds. Marigolds are really great companion plants for tomatoes because they prevent harmful nematodes that will get at tomato plants' roots from getting there. They deter the nematodes. What else? Things like alliums, like onions and garlic, prevent aphids, slugs, and like rabbits. So if you want to plant like onions and garlic around something that you're worried about getting aphids, like kale. And companion planting is also like, it can be a good deterrent for pests, but it can also just be good for plants. So I think of like the 3 sisters method, which is an indigenous planting method of growing beans, corns, and squash together. They all complement each other really well. You grow the corn first, so it acts like a pole, and then you plant your beans around the corn, and it will grow up the corn. And then you grow squash to shade the soil to keep the moisture in. And that does add to having like really an ideal healthy plant system going on to prevent more. There'll be really happy plants, and pests will be less likely to get at really happy, healthy plants. And then there's something called BT, which is a bacterium that is poisonous to some insects, but harmless to really beneficial. So if there are like, you have a crazy aphid, well, I guess they're good for like leaf eating caterpillars. If you're seeing a lot of those around, you can spray BT, and that's really pretty harmless. And so with integrated pest management, there is a chemical, you can use chemicals. Always say this is a last resort, and only to use it if there is working, and to make sure you're following directions on the label. And similar to fertilizers, you're with chemical sprays and such, look for the OMRI approved or organic. So things that you can use are like insecticidal soaps. They work really well on aphids, thrips, mites, and caterpillars. What they do is they kill the exoskeleton of the insect. But the one thing it does not kill are eggs. So you will have to repeat spraying if you want to use an insecticidal soap. There's also neem oil, which kills fungus growth on plants. And it will smother soft-bodied pests like aphids, mites, and whiteflies, and some insect eggs. And then there's also like iron phosphate granules. If you're having a big slug problem, what they do is the slugs will eat it, and then they'll just dry out. It'll take a little time, but they will die from that, and that's pretty safe and harmless for it won't get into your food and be harmful for you. Let's see. And that's it. Those are the sustainable garden practices that I went over today. Thanks so much for y'all's time. Not sure if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. And also here is my contact information in case you want to reach out via email. You could reach me at my work email here, which is the knoxcac.org one, or our beardsleyfarm@gmail.com email for any questions that might come up later.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really informative. I'll have to come back to this video in the future when I start gardening again. We do have a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So the first one was from Katie, and she asked if it was possible to add too much compost, or the more the better.
Oh, yes. You don't want to add too much. Like I was saying before, so I don't know if you were there for what the ratio of soil looks like. Typically, it's like 2% organic matter, which is that compost. So really, you're gonna want to add about 2 to 4 inches, like above your soil. You don't want to add too much, because then too much organic matter. You want a good mix of organic matter and rock parts, so you don't want too much, but 2 to 4 inches is a really great amount for your garden bed.
And then I had a question, and I think you did kind of actually address it as the presentation went on, but I was just, do you want to add straw and mulch, etc., around the plants during the growing season as well, or just kind of during the winter dormant season?
Yeah. So we like, yeah, good question. Yeah, so I like to add straw to plants that are currently growing in my garden. So like if I'm growing when you grow kale, it's about 8 inches apart between each plant, but there's all this empty space. We're gonna want to put straw to cover those empty spaces. But yeah, I like to put straw around established plants, like whether it's kale, tomatoes, whatever I'm growing. Once they're established, I like to gently add my straw around each of the plants as mulch.
Okay, cool. And then Michael was wondering if the community compost bin at Beardsley was always open.
Yeah, good question. So I would say email us at beardsleyfarm@gmail.com. We are typically here as Beardsley team members. We're typically here Monday through Friday 8 to 4:45. So the gates are open then, and you can add your compost then. But if I would just say email us if you do want to bring compost by, and we can let you know that we'll be here and you can drop it off. And if it's your first time, we'll show you where to bring it. And I should also mention, we only have a little bit left, but so that's if you want to drop off compost, like food scraps to our garden. If you need finished compost, the city did drop off some manure. It's not really compost, but it's really great nutrients. It's like aged manure from a horse farm, local horse farm. We have some available if you need it. It's not a ton left, but you can come by. And if you have questions about that, you can email us at beardsleyfarm@gmail.com. But yeah, we add compost and manure to our beds because we do not make enough compost here to be able to amend all of our beds. So we do supplement with manure, which is really great for the garden too.
That's good to know. And I think there's a few drop-offs. I can't remember them off the top of my head around the city where you can pick up manure and compost and stuff too. But it looks like that's it for the questions. So
yeah, I think you should be able to look.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that you can go on to Knox County or Knox City's website, and all that information of like the drop-off locations are on there. I would just say like Google
compost. That's good to know. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate it. This is a great presentation. And thank you everyone for attending our Thursday talks. We'll have another one in June. We really appreciate everyone's time this morning.